Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to welcome you all to this IGE Samsung Electronics Global Business Forum on behalf of IGE. I think IGE and the Samsung Electronics must have control over the weather, and after many rains, finally this morning we could see bright sun. It's indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to be a moderator of this forum, and especially because we have a very distinguished speaker today who will speak on the Chinese economic policy making. As you all know, China has placed firmly as number 2 economy in the world itself. And the U.S. economy is still the most important economy to Korean economic performance through direct and indirect channels. Actually, U.S. economy's effect on Europe, China, and Japan has a tremendous indirect impact on Korea. And also through indirect channels, such as its dominant role in international financial system, U.S. economy is still the most important economy to us. But China, as a through the direct channel, is the most important country to Korean economic performance. Our export to China is more than double to that of the United States. And China has emerged by far the largest trading partner and one of the most important economy to Korea. And as you have read recently, there are many worries about Chinese economic performance. And second quarter's growth rate was just announced to 7.5%. And I guess a couple days ago, the Article 4 consultation report by the IMF was released, and it forecast about 7.7% of growth. It's within the ballpark of what usually had been expected, but still it's quite a low performance compared to that of 2 to 3 years ago. And this slowing down or decelerating of Chinese economies give some concerns about the economic recovery prospect of Korea, because we are quite dependent on Chinese market. And I think in this vein, it's quite timely and fortunate that we have one of the most respected expert and observer of Chinese economy. And Mr. Bob Davis very graciously accepted to our invitation. And if I may introduce him briefly, Mr. Bob Davis is currently a senior editor who covers the Chinese economy after many years of covering international economy in D.C. And over the last 2 years, he has been actually residing in Beijing. In Washington, he ran economic coverage during the global financial crisis, and before that, reported on Washington's response to Asian financial crisis. In 2000, he was awarded the Raymond Clapper Award for Washington reporting for coverage of White House negotiations with China of the WTO accession. And a year earlier, he was part of a team of journal reporters that won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for coverage of the Asian and the Russian financial crisis. This morning, he will speak on Chinese economic policy making, a foreigner's perspective. And ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Davis to the podium.
Is this working? Yes, it is working. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the invitation here. As was said, I did cover the Asia financial crisis. I don't have much experience in Korea, but I was here during the worst of the crisis when I was covering the Treasury Department and was covering the International Monetary Fund. And then I was here 10 years later covering the G20 when it was here. And I was always remarking what an amazingly lovely change. Seoul is just a beautiful city. And I know people are complaining about the weather here, but my wife's here with me also. And we came into the airport and we said, look, we can see miles away. I mean, there's no fog, there's no smog. We can breathe. I mean, it's, you know, it's like coming to an oxygen bar or something. So, so we're very happy to be here. I just wanted to make clear kind of what I know something about and what I'm still learning about. So I'm largely a Washington reporter. I've spent more than 25 years in Washington with some breaks, basically. I ran our coverage of the European Union at a time when Europe was not in the news, was mostly, as my colleagues would say, you know, a beautiful museum where nobody really worried too much about Europe. And then I ran our coverage of Latin America, which is a wonderful place, full of incredibly interesting people, but also at that point out of the news. And then here, or not here, then in China. So a lot of my observations basically are kind of looking at different capitals and kind of seeing what's similar and what isn't. So I thought what I would do is talk a little about the Chinese economy, and then also talk about the role that foreigners play in the Chinese economy and Chinese policymaking in any event. Again, mostly clearly from the perspective of an American. As to the state of the economy, the big question is it slowing and how much? And the answer is yes, it's slowing quite a bit. And I think it's slowing more rapidly than the government. It's clearly slowing more rapidly than the government expected. The government set a target of 7.5% growth. But in China, when they use these targets, they're not literally targets. For 15 years running, they exceeded the target, and usually by 1 or 2 percentage points. Basically, the target was meant for the local governments. It was kind of a symbolic target. So if they had it at 8%, they knew the people in Beijing knew if you're a provincial leader, you don't want to be below the target. You want to be above the target, of course. And so it was kind of a signal of roughly a floor. And everybody would exceed that. So, and when they set it, they moved it, not this year, but last year, from 8% to 7.5%. They kept it at 7.5% for this year. But the idea wasn't literally 8 to 7, or 7.5. The idea was they were comfortable with some slowing down of the economy. And now we're in a situation where for the first half of the year, they've grown at 7.6%. Just a slightly higher than their official target. Most analysts think they'll grow slower than 7.5%. And that would be the first time since 1998 if that were to happen. So it wouldn't be, what's the difference honestly between 7.3% and 7.5%? Probably nothing, particularly given it's hard to trust the statistics in China. But it would be a big political setback. I mean, here you have the first year of a new administration, clearly a very self-confident leader in Xi Jinping, and right out of the box, they missed their economic target for the first time in 15 years. The only thing that they can, in a political fashion, what they can say is, well, it was the other guy, as in any capital. They could say it was the other guy's fault. It was, that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao didn't do the reforms that were necessary. I mean, they don't, if this were Washington, they would say that exactly. Obama would blame Bush would blame Clinton. Nobody would have any there would be no ambiguity about any of it. But it's China, so it would be done in a more subtle fashion. But that would be the basic thing they could say. So it also gives them an opportunity to say, well, we were slow before. Here's our opportunity to make changes. So what they said was, what the new leaders have said repeatedly is they're willing to accept slower growth. That slower growth is a mark of reform. But really what's happened is they have slower growth, but they don't have reform. There's no evidence so far of any, in my view, of any significant reforms being passed. They're talking about reform. They're trying to plan a substantial, sweeping effort to make changes in a variety of different places. That's supposed to be introduced in October at a party convention. But, at this point, who knows how sweeping it'll be, and even if they'll make their October deadline, they may wind up pushing that meeting back. So it's a very difficult time. You have the economy slowing. They're not quite sure. Presents them with a real challenge. Do they go back to their old ways of stimulating the economy to make sure they don't miss their essentially political target? Or do they actually go ahead with the reforms that could slow growth substantially less than that? I think what's happened in China in terms of the economy are two things, basically. Externally, it's not their fault. Korea faces the same problem. The U.S. economy is struggling to recover. Europe is in a much worse state. Japan, who knows what's happening in Japan, but they're trying. But still, the global economy is really quite weak. So, to the degree they're still dependent on exports, which they are to a large degree, even it's not just simply exports and imports, but it's the whole system that's built on producing things that are good for export. And I think this is quite recognizable to people here. China, to a very large extent, essentially copied the development plan of Korea and Japan before that to rely on export-led growth, and it's breaking down. The way I look at it is the wheels aren't coming off the Chinese economy, but they're starting to wobble quite a bit. If you think back, and I'm sure they didn't plan it this way, there's nobody that smart, but they had a really brilliant development model, which was twofold. One was kind of what economists would call the advantage, so to speak, of backwardness. They're a very poor place, as Korea was. But in addition to being poor, when people talk about the Chinese miracle and the sort of 10% growth for 30 years, which no other countries have managed, it's all true, but it's also, remember, that the incredibly maniacal rule of the Communist Party under Mao put them in a tremendous hole. One horrendous campaign after another that impoverished Chinese people more and more and more. So they were starting from a very low base from which they started to rebound. And so their basic goal, their basic idea, which again I don't think Deng Xiaoping was smart enough, or anybody was smart enough to really figure out from the start, was now in retrospect you can see, is to create export cities basically on the coast, and then to build infrastructure throughout the rest of the country, basically to bring poor peasants to the export zones to work for next to nothing, and turn themselves into, and they're very industrious people, turn themselves into to the factory floor of the world. Again, it was brilliant. They, as we know here, they've become the world's biggest exporter. Who would have thought that 10 years ago? And in addition, they've built many of their investment projects the infrastructure projects made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense to build trains and highways, to bring people from Sichuan and elsewhere to Shenzhen and Guangzhou and other places. It also made sense to invest heavily in capital-intensive industries, that some of which produced goods like steel that were used in construction and in many of the things that they made for export, and to invest in things like the electricity grid. All this made a lot of sense, but then they just kept on doing it. And for years, economists have warned that eventually you're going to wind up in a situation where the investments aren't efficient, where they're essentially wasting money. And I think that's kind of what's happened now. I mean, you can go all over China, everywhere, and you'll see, the sort of famous ghost cities. You'll just see these projects going up, and you can see right through the buildings. Now, some of these, and so what that's led a lot of what we call China bears, economists and investors who are very negative on China, to conclude is that it's sort of like the U.S. was in 2007. A massive real estate bubble that will someday, or pretty soon, burst and take down the banks. It's different in China. Many of those housing projects are actually sold to investors. Many of them to, on the bad side, they're sold to party officials who have advantaged positions, and that's the way they get their money. But ordinary Chinese people too, because part of the model as well was to provide cheap capital for these infrastructure projects and for these favored companies, most of which were state-owned. And so how did they do that? They did that basically by making victims of their own consumers. So the deposit rates in banks set by the government, they're often at rates lower than inflation. Chinese people aren't stupid. They realize they're getting very little in the bank. So what do they do with their money? Well, they can't invest it abroad. They're not allowed to. The stock market is seen as a rigged game, and also when it boomed and it busted, and so people got nervous about that. They can invest in things like gold or Maotai or some other fad of the moment, but I think that's mostly for wealthy people, and that will boom and that will bust also. So what they wind up investing in is real estate, and so you see just again, overbuilding and overbuilding. But if that were to go bad, it doesn't mean that it necessarily ricochets through the banking system and takes down the whole economy, as happened in the U.S. What it would mean, because the investors to buy apartments usually have to put down large down payments, it would mean a big dent in the finances of many, many Chinese households. So I think if things go bad, what you're looking at is not a Lehman Brothers kind of moment, but more of a Japan-style slowdown. Maybe not literally to zero as Japan did, but that kind of you were at 11%, then you were at 10, now you're at 7, and then what? Even a establishment investment house like Barclays. Among the China bears, it's been faddish for years to say that China's going to slow. But now it's getting into the regular investment houses. They predicted, or they forecast that what they said was it wasn't, I forget exactly how they put it, but it was a plausible scenario that China's growth could slow to 3%. Over the next couple of years, although they say if it does slow that fast, it would be short for a very short time and they would rebound. But just imagine, for the sake of argument, that it slowed to 3% for one quarter. Who knows what would happen at that point? It's totally uncharted territory, and I think that's what they're worried about. That kind of a market slowdown coming in from a direction that they didn't expect. A crisis is by definition something most people didn't expect. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a crisis. So what I'd like to talk about also is what about what's the role of foreigners there? Do they care? Does the Chinese government really care about what the rest of the world thinks? And does the rest of the world, which has lots of experience that could help avoid some of these problems, do outsiders have some influence still in China, which is the world's second largest economy by virtually everyone's estimate? Unless they screw up unbelievably, they'll be the world's largest economy. You can pick your years, 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, however optimistic you are on China and pessimistic on the U.S. The arithmetic is obvious. China has 4 times the population of the United States. So all they need to do is have a per capita GDP of 26% of the U.S., and they'll be the world's largest economy. So I guess to me, on reflection, it's more surprising to me that it hasn't happened before. I mean, just imagine the mismanagement in a country where they have that sort of advantage, and they have been a minor player for so many years, and now they're finally moving back into the role that they had in the past, and they should have. One of the reasons, one answer from the Chinese could be, we don't really care. I mean, we've done great for 30 years. What do we need to listen to anybody for? People have said that our model doesn't make sense, that it's too state-controlled. It's been criticized by liberal economists around the world, and meanwhile, we're doing well, and the rest of the world's doing badly. That could be one response, but there are nationalist voices that certainly say things like that, but that isn't generally the way, as far as I can tell, the way people think there. I think, in fact, it's just the opposite. They're sort of still, amazingly to me, looking for outside approval. Some of that, I think, is psychological and has to do with the role of the Communist Party. I mean, the reigning mythology of China is that they were a great country that was humiliated by foreigners, and the Communist Party did away with that humiliation. Kicked out the foreigners, restored China to its rightful place. I mean, there's a famous quote by Mao in 1949 when the communists won control. He says, "Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation," which is the way I think, and also you hear it now, the echoes of that repeated in, I think, Xi Jinping's now famous talk about the China dream. In America, in the U.S., there's an American dream, right? And the American dream, I think, is pretty broadly understood to be the idea that you can come to the U.S. with nothing and turn yourself into somebody. It's a question of self-improvement and freedom. I'm not saying that it's true for everybody, and it's like a myth, basically, but that is what Americans believe. That's what Americans think makes the U.S. special. And in China, it's a different thing. When they talk about the China dream, as far as one can tell, it's not about that. It's not about bringing the rest of the country from poverty to prosperity. It's more about national revival. It's more of a nationalist dream about political power expressed on a global stage, which is really quite interesting to me. Of course, they want, like any government, they want their people to prosper, but that seems to be still quite secondary to this idea of national humiliation and overcoming that. So as a result, they're actually quite open, I think, for an economy that's done so well, to ideas from outsiders. I think the way I interpret Xi's and Obama's summit is along those kinds of lines. As far as we can tell it was the Chinese that asked for a quick meeting between the two leaders. And so, and the U.S., of course, was happy to do it. They're obsessed, as is every other country, obsessed with China's rise. But it is the idea, I think, that China wanted to be seen, and their new leader wanted to be seen as the equal of the American president. And here he was, just a couple of months in office, and he's sitting with Obama, and they're talking for days, and they're doing it in an informal fashion, doing it at a place that's known. Has some ties to Richard Nixon, who would not normally be Barack Obama's hero, but who was clearly instrumental in opening China, restoring China-U.S. relations. And so I don't know that they talked or they made any particular progress on any issue of any substance, but the pictures is like a McLuhan-esque, Marshall McLuhan idea where the medium is the message. I mean, the pictures go out, Xi and Obama together. I don't think Xi plays golf, I don't know whether he plays golf. I don't know if they golfed together, but I mean, they got along, and it was certainly a relationship of equals. I think that made a difference. So as I say, some of it is psychological. And then also, as we were sort of talking, they've been basically pursuing a catch-up strategy. It's what people will call the advantage of backwardness, as I mentioned. So they were so far behind. What they could do is borrow or use or steal technologies from more developed countries, apply them very smartly, and there was lots of room to catch up, and so you would have very, very rapid growth. Well, as I say, that's coming to an end. So they're at a point where you need to make a switch. Korea did it, Japan did it, but not many countries do. Most countries kind of get stuck. The term middle-income trap has become more and more in vogue, but I think there's something to it. The way I look at it is, if you were to look at the most powerful and economically powerful countries before World War I, and you were to look at them now, pretty much the same group of countries with a few exceptions. Korea is one of them. Singapore would be another. I mean, that are at the level of advanced countries. Israel would be a third. I mean, it's not many countries manage to do it. And as I said, I used to cover Latin America, and they would, they do okay, but then they will reach a certain level, and then there'll be another crisis that'll knock them back down. And, why that happens is really hard to know, but it does. So they're at a point at which they need to innovate. They need to come up with their own ideas. They need to figure out new strategies. And they know this. They certainly know it. They talk about innovation all the time, but it's hard. I mean, it's not an easy thing. If it was an easy thing, everybody would have advanced to the level of Korea, and not everybody does. If you were to think about it, as I say, they sort of borrowed the Korean model or the Japanese model. But one thing that they didn't do, that both countries did, was figure out a system that produced some world-class companies. When you think of China, can you think of one Samsung, one Hyundai, one Panasonic, one Sony? I mean, there aren't any of them. And I think my reading of Japan and Korea was that those companies that I just mentioned might have been certainly were protected domestically, but were forced to compete internationally. And that competition made a huge difference. And so now those companies Samsung is one of the most innovative companies in the world. It's a huge rival to the best companies elsewhere. And there isn't a single company in China like that. The most innovative ones are in the internet area, but that the internet is protected because of political reasons from competition from the Googles and eBays and so ons of the world. And it's very unclear whether they would be able to thrive absent those kind of protections or whether they could expand internationally. So that's a big problem. That's a big problem because they clearly haven't produced a system that allows for this sort of innovation. And I think also their idea about how to innovate, it's part of the planning mentality. We'll have a 5-year plan in strategic emerging industries. It sounds great. Most countries do that. But by the time any government official, even really smart ones, comes up with a list of 10 industries of the future, those industries are not of the future. They're the industries of the moment, because it isn't the role. It isn't the government officials don't have the knowledge to understand what might be the next thing. It's just by the nature of things. So again, it's sort of it's not a bad thing, but it's not the sort of effort that would be required to truly innovate. It's more, there'll be a lot of spending. There'll be some big headlines. The other day, China once again produced the world's fastest supercomputer. That sounds impressive, right? I mean, that's got to be a good thing. But if you look a little more closely at it, it's not, scientists tell me, it's not that big a deal. I mean, basically, the technology for producing supercomputers is well known. And if you're willing to put enough money into it, you can for some period of time have the world's fastest supercomputer. But the more important thing is, well, how do you use these machines? What's the purpose of these machines? Unless you can figure out this, not just the software, which is difficult enough, but the usefulness of them, work them into your economic system, they're kind of like trophies. It's the equivalent, the scientific equivalent of doing well at the Olympics or winning the World Cup. It's nice, it makes you feel good, but it doesn't have the sort of fundamental effect that you would hope it would have. I think the fundamental question for China, sort of the existential question for China, is to what degree does the government let go? To what degree do they recede? Do they move back? Do they let the native abilities of Chinese people, educated and some not educated Chinese people, move to the fore? This is a difficult question for lots of countries because the government exists to govern, right? I mean, in any country. But it's a particular problem in China where you have a one-party system. What I like to tell people, when I describe China, I find the word communist kind of gets in the way, because at least to an American, when you think of communism, you think of the Soviet Union. And it's clearly, obviously not the Soviet Union, or maybe you think of North Korea here. I mean, it's obviously not that. It's way freer than that, and it's way more, the development is way more genuine. But it is a one-party state, and there are plenty of one-party states. You folks had one. One that I covered was in Mexico. I mean, it was a very successful one-party, successful in the sense of retaining power, one-party state for decades, with essentially no democracy. I mean, in China, the anti-democratic forces and the strength of the government is far greater than anything there was in Mexico. But still, I mean, the goal of the ruling party is to rule, and to the degree they move back and let other forces, independent forces, emerge, well, what's their purpose? What's their purpose? And so that it's an ideological and philosophical and existential question, and also it's a very practical question. I mean, if you're not the ones ruling, well, how come, you lose all your perks, you lose all your power? So it's a very, very difficult question, but I think unless it is one that at some point they deal with, they'll be limited. Their future will be limited because there's only so much smart mandarins can do. One thing, the way I sort of look at it is, if you look at, in a sports metaphor, if you look at Chinese ping pong versus Chinese basketball, I mean, the Chinese are the best at ping pong. There's nobody close. You go to the Olympics, even when there are teams from Bolivia or something, there'll be Chinese people, who've moved to Bolivia or something. You go around China, you see ping pong courts everywhere. People play all over the place. They have their national teams, but it's also from the ground up. It's something they love to do. You go and they also love basketball, and they're terrible at basketball. They produced Yao Ming, and that's about it. For 1 billion people, they produce fewer truly great basketball players than Lithuania does with 3 million people. And one of the things you notice is that all the basketball courts are largely locked up. You can't just sort of wander over and play ball. I mean, you just can't do it. I mean, it's controlled by the state, by the schools, and by various parks, but they're all locked up, and so the sort of natural forces of competition and people getting ahead and just love of doing what they're doing, it doesn't allow itself to play out, and so they basically import. I mean, if you've ever seen a Chinese professional Chinese basketball game, I mean, it's like 3 Chinese players passing to 2 big American players or European players who score all the points. I mean, it's not a recipe for producing greatness, and that, in a metaphorical sense, is, I think, the problem that the Chinese have in economic matters as well. So what do? They know they have this problem of innovation. They're not really making a hell of a lot of progress given how much money they've spent. So they import experts. During the 5-year plan, which is a mishmash, which is a gigantic mishmash of goals that they set for the coming 5 years, before they put that together the last time, they had this incredibly a panel of just the world's leading experts on lots and lots of things, lots of Nobel laureates with lots of ideas of what they ought to do about various aspects of the economy, and their report is published. It's you can find it online. It's a group called Karen Cross supported it, and they published the book. And the person who was in charge of it, a guy named Lu He, who's now in charge of the reform effort, wrote a foreword to this book. He said, all the people in there should be awarded medals for their service to China and coming up with these ideas. And then you look at the ideas, and they're pretty much the same kind of ideas that have been floating around for years about the basic movement of the economy away from investment in labor-intensive industries and infrastructure, and reliance on exports to more services, domestic-led economy, and so on. It's the stuff that they've been talking about there for years. But why the foreign experts? I think what happens is it helps them sell it internally. It's not only that Mr. Liu here says this and that. It's also that these 5 Nobel laureates, say it as well. And so it becomes, it's been an interesting way in which China has tried to adopt international standards, is not say, God forbid, they wouldn't say we're following the Americans. That would clearly not play well. But they're moving to international standards. There's an interesting book on a different subject on the Chinese airlines by a reporter, a U.S. journalist named James Fallows, and he talks about their efforts to develop an aviation industry. And some years ago, thankfully before I got here or got to Beijing, China had a terrible safety record. And people were afraid to fly, and that clearly was not going to help if you were going to get a lot of foreign investment. And so what they did very cleverly, instead of talking about moving the air traffic system to American standards, they talked about it in terms of adopting international standards, which was much more acceptable and palatable to to Chinese officials. It turns out the international standards were based on U.S. standards, but in any event, it wound up to be adopted. China's airlines are very safe. They're can be maddening, as people here, I'm sure, if you've been in China, know. I mean, you go and you can't count on the airlines ever landing on when they say they're going to land, but they land safely. And so I think it's the same idea, the same model of trying to import foreign experts and, you know, say that you're moving up to international standards. So, I mean, you look at the 5-year plan, it's got all sorts of ideas, but as always, implementation is the key. In 2007, I'm not going to get the quote right, but Wen Jiabao said that the system was unstable. There were 4 uns. They call them the 4 uns, but the unstable, unsustainable, on this and on that. And he was right. I mean, he was right. They couldn't have written a better speech in the U.S. Treasury, but they did very little to make any difference. And then there's sometimes the way in which outsiders have an input there or make a difference in China, is that Chinese leaders will use their participation in international agreements or institutions as a way to push reform at home. So the most famous was Zhu Rongji when joining the World Trade Organization. I covered that. Zhu, it seemed, you know, from a Washington perspective, was essentially ready to agree to most anything. He had a plan for changing China's economy. Really wasn't going anywhere. They looked at the WTO as a way to lock in reforms at home, because they could then say, well, we made these commitments, you know, we're sorry, but we have to carry them out at whatever cost. I mean, when he came to the U.S., as I said, it seemed a very generous offer that he was making. So generous, in fact, that the White House turned him down, because I think for their domestic politics, the American domestic politics, to just, excuse me, just to agree to whatever the Chinese were saying would make Washington, in the eyes of many Americans, seem too weak. Oh, we didn't push him hard enough. And so they turned him down. It was remarkable. This is what I covered. And that prize that was referred to was about this. It was amazing that they turned the guy down, and they didn't have any particular. There was some disputes over something about agriculture, but it was pretty minor league. And then, you know, but they had to send him packing. It seemed like a tremendously, you know, really terrible idea, basically. But then, you know, a couple of weeks, I think it was a couple of weeks, or maybe it wasn't very long afterwards, they wound up reaching a deal. So then, I guess it probably worked for the Chinese side as well. Both sides could say they went through these tremendously difficult negotiations. I mean, the negotiations had been going on for years. But once the Chinese decided to end them and end them by largely conceding most of the points, they moved pretty quickly. But in the end, so they both could say, well, the Chinese could say, well, listen, I mean, we came there, they turned us down, you know, we weren't going to settle for anything, we went back again, and the Americans could say the same thing. You know, we agreed to China, we know China, they would say, because in American politics, as you probably know, there's a great ambivalence about China. There's, on the one hand, the sort of sense that China represents the future. On the other hand, there's the sense that, I guess, the future's not looking so great. So China is a competitor. And so the idea is to sort of look tough on China. And that way you can try to head off some of the criticism that you'll face about making a deal. This was a Democratic administration. It was the Clinton administration. And the labor unions there are always tremendously suspicious of low-cost competition, and so they had to handle that as well. So anyway, China then made a lot of changes. There's complaints that they don't live up to their WTO obligations as much as they can, but there's probably complaints about every country in the world about that. But in general, I think it's been a good thing. It helped China enormously in terms of attracting investment, further investment, and opening up export markets to it. And I mean, the trade, China's trade zoomed after their accession into the WTO. And you see this happening now again with RMB, RMB internationalization. If the central banker of China went to the either the State Council, which is the top governing body of the government, or the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the top the ruling body of the party and the most important party. A lot of the people are on both, a lot of the same characters, and said, you know, what I want to do is liberalize interest rates and open the capital account and let the yuan freely move up and down according to markets, not according to what we say. Well, first of all, like any political leader, probably the first reaction is, what did you say? I mean, these are really technical issues, not the sort of things that political leaders would get involved in. But if you then said, listen, China's the power on the rise. This is with 2008. America, you know, who we always thought had the sort of sense of how to run an economy, has just ran its economy into the tank. We're tremendously dependent, as is so many other countries, on the dollar. I mean, what does a rising power like China need to do? It needs to make its currency, you know, an international standard as well. And that they bought onto. So it's a very nationalist pitch for an international goal, but it actually, what it entails is a lot of this other stuff that seems in the weeds, but is very important. The opening the capital account, not fully, but more. Letting the RMB float, not 100%, but more. And as we were saying there, the ambassador is trying to help them figure out the kinds of reforms that are needed, but it becomes an umbrella under which to make a lot of very particular necessary changes. And I think also you can see that in the recent strategic and economic dialogue. Nothing of substance, as far as I could tell, was decided there. And almost never, I'm in the unfortunate situation of having to report on these things, and you read these giant communiques and you're looking for anything. You're just sort of desperate to sort of say, well, here's something new, and usually there's very little. I think part of it this time was from the Chinese side, you have a new government, even though they're sort of the same characters kind of promoted. But the Americans relied, and so did other foreigners, relied on Wang Qishan as their intermediary, as a guy who understood the bureaucracy and how to get things changed in China, and so could help the Chinese government fulfill promises that they made. Well, all of a sudden, he's in a different position. He's in an incredibly important position on the anti-corruption campaign, but meanwhile, he's kind of off to the side when it comes to economic issues. And then Wang Yang, who was most recently the party secretary in Guangdong province, a man known for economic reform, he has this role of liaison with the Americans. It's sort of a role equal to the Treasury Secretary. And you wonder, well, you know, does he really know how to maneuver within the bureaucracy in Beijing? I mean, it's an open question. But I thought he had a great metaphor there in the sort of breaking the mold of Chinese officials all looking like robots. I mean, he tried to make some jokes, which I thought was great. It's kind of to the degree that Chinese officials are humanized. I think that makes it for the American public and for the for the global public, it makes it less frightening and more, gives you a greater understanding that people you're dealing with are just people and you can do business with them. So he made a joke about how, the U.S. and China are like an old married couple, that they'll fight, they'll have arguments, but they'll stay together. And he then, as an aside, said, well, because the cost of divorce is too large. And then he made a reference to my ultimate boss, Rupert Murdoch, and his wife, Wendy Dong, and said, well, look at that, look how much their divorce is going to cost them. So I think it's not like an old married couple. I mean, that would be like the U.S. and Europe, I would say. But still, there's a lot to it. Both sides know they have to get along. If they don't get along, the costs are astronomical. So anyway, although there was nothing of substance that was decided there, I think what you can look at the SNED is a way, again, an international agreement, in this case a bilateral agreement, where the Americans make commitments just equally to the Chinese, so it's not this sort of question of humiliation and inequality and so on. I mean, both sides make commitments. But if you read the Chinese side, you get a pretty decent idea of the reforms that they're planning to make. I mean, they had, for instance, they talked about market-based benchmark interest rates, letting the market play a more important role in credit allocation. I mean, that's crucial for China. They know it's crucial. Increasing Social Security and employment spending by 2 percentage points. I mean, I don't think, the Americans might want to take credit for this, but I doubt that the U.S. negotiator was saying, no, I want 3 percentage points, and the Chinese were saying, no, we can only do 1. I mean, it's probably the sorts of things that the Chinese want to get done domestically. And then an increase in dividends paid by the state-owned enterprises, natural resources prices set by the market, more supervision of state-owned enterprises so they respect intellectual property, among other things. Opening up the services sector. They're doing a Shanghai Free Trade Zone, which is supposed to be the sort of ultimate in free trade zones where you'll be able to exchange currencies and do all sorts of things that foreign firms are barred from doing now. Start government bond futures and have that market open to foreigners as well. And then a bilateral investment treaty, which is what got some attention, at the degree that anything got attention. Which they are to negotiate, which could contain similar things, similar promises on investment. Well, it all sounds familiar. It sounds like the sort of Zhurongji strategy. Commit yourself in a binding, since binding is as binding as anything international, any international agreement can be, in a binding agreement, and then take it back and say, listen, we have to make this change and this change and that change. We've agreed to it. And yes, there's, this powerful interest and that powerful interest, but we have obligations. The key difference between when Zhurongji did this in, I forget when it was exactly, but 10 years ago roughly, and now is when Zhurongji did it, the state-owned enterprises were all losing money. They were bleeding. The banks were, I think the bad loans are 40%. I mean, they knew they were in deep trouble. They had to make big changes. Well, now state-owned enterprises are some of the biggest companies in the world. The banks still allocate money in an inefficient way, but they're guaranteed to make profits, and they make profits. So now you have really powerful interests opposing them, and this is where Beijing starts looking like any other capital. So you have the government pushing one way, and you have, first of all, the government's divided among dozens of different interests. And then secondly, you have players outside that all of a sudden have lots of power. It's not clear, in the popular retelling, the state-owned enterprises are agents of Beijing who do Beijing's bidding and are now colonizing Africa, and then the next thing they'll do is who knows what. There's some of that. Obviously, the central government plays an important role in setting their priorities and naming who gets to be the head of the various state-owned enterprises and replacing them, which is a tremendous amount of power. But on the other hand, these are powerful bureaucracies in and of themselves that have their own dynamic. And part of their dynamic is to, is to pay attention to their political leaders, and part of it is to make money like any other company. I did a story with a colleague about the head of ICBC, the largest bank by assets in the world. And the head of it, Jiang Zhenxing, was the only one of the four major banks, the four big state-owned banks, not to get a promotion during this last round of when the new administration came into power, when the party selected new leaders. The only one. And so, and he is broadly considered the best of the bankers in China, the smartest of the bankers. So what happened? He did well, the bank prospered, and he's the guy who doesn't get a promotion. And then you sort of peel it back, and basically the thing he did wrong was in 2009 when Wen Jiabao said we need to stimulate the economy, which in reality meant banks, you got to lend and lend and lend and lend. ICBC lent more, but they did it in a much more responsible fashion. They were worried that they would a lot of their loans would wind up once again as bad loans or kind of ghost loans or zombie loans that they have to just keep turning over and turning over. That has become one of the biggest weaknesses in China, that whole thing of letter credit expanding way too fast and for really bad projects. But so you could say he was farsighted, but that's not the way it was looked at. It was looked at as that he didn't follow the party's commands, and so he didn't get the promotion. Anyway, so I digress there. But I mean, the party definitely has control, but the institutions and people that would be impacted by needed reforms are very powerful. I mean, just one other example. So there's, a housing bubble or close to a housing bubble in many, many cities in China. One obvious thing to do would be to introduce a property tax. So, I mean, right now what happens is you buy an apartment and you tend to hold on to it because the thinking in China, frighteningly, is that the value of real estate can only go up. And unlike other countries, you don't have to pay any taxes on the property. So it's pretty much costless for you to hold this property until you decide to sell. There's not a rental market because the Chinese believe that if you rent it, it kind of reduces the value of a new apartment. And so this necessary change, which would slow down presumably the rate at which the market increased and put some more rationality into it, never gets done. And one of the reasons it never gets done, I mean, is first of all, everybody owns apartments, and they don't want to see the value of their property go down. And in addition, wealthy people, many of them connected to the party or party leaders, own multiple apartments, and so that they would be an obstacle to what seems to be a, obvious change that they need to make. So as I say, they use these international treaties to try to help them push through these needed changes. So I guess, sort of wrapping up, that it seems to me that there's plenty of room for influence. China is a big country getting larger. And we're about to, over the next couple of decades, find ourselves in a very different kind of situation than the world has been in since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if China becomes the largest economy in the world, which is, again, very likely unless they really mess things up, say over the next 15 years, you'll have a situation where the largest economy in the world isn't the richest by far. On a per person average. And since the Industrial Revolution, that's been the case. Basically, the richest power was the largest economy as well. And then we're in uncharted territories. I mean, you'll have the United States as is still a very powerful economy, but not number one, but a much, much wealthier country. And then you'll have China as the world's largest economy but it kind of the, income level of, Argentina. And how that plays out, I mean, I think will be fascinating. China's always fascinating, but at this moment is anyone's guess. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for your insightful and observations and analysis. It was very interesting. You can
Okay.
answer there, or you can come over there for question. Now the floor is open. May I ask you, say your name and affiliation when you make a question or comments? And also, I will appreciate if you make that short and precise. There are a lot of hand raising. Let me take questions in groups. First, may I ask Ambassador?
Thank you. Mr. Davis, two very quick questions. My name is Vishnu Prakash. I'm the Ambassador of India. One, you just alluded to, when you talked of internal factors for the economic slowdown, you just alluded to the excessive infrastructure, or the housing bubble, or ghost towns, as you called them. So that could be one, but could you also identify for us some of the other important internal factors which have led to the slowdown and which may have a lasting impact? That is one. Two, speaking in more simplistic terms, it is generally said that there is a kind of a socio-political compact between the party or the government and the people. The party gives the people a certain growth rate and said to be at least 8 to 10%, and people let the party rule. So, give them the freedom to continue what they are doing. Now, is that socio-political compact fraying as you see that? And if it is fraying, what will be the impact on the polity of China in the medium to long term? Thank you.
That's a very good question and a fundamental question. Because there's quite a few questions. Let me take 3 questions in group and then go to another round. Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. My question is very simple. If China succeeds in making reform, you strongly argued for, then what do you think China's economic growth rate? We are quite often misled that if China makes reform, then Chinese economy is likely to recover. But I think, very unfortunately, it will not be the case. I'm saying this because China's nowadays, its economic structural problems resembles in many aspects to that of Korea's structural problems we faced before our financial crisis in 1997. And Korea made sweeping reforms in every aspect of our economy, but our growth rate fell very sharply from about 8% to about 4%. So my hunch is that even when China succeeds in reforming its economy, its growth rate will very likely much lower than compared to for the last 2 or 3 decades. So I think we have to be ready to China's lower economic growth rate, which is likely 6 or 5%. I think this is very uncomfortable, but this is truth. So I think I ask for your views about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. An, please.
My name is An Chung-yang, Foreign Investment Ombudsman. Well, I think one of the characteristics of Chinese economy could be found in the fundamental linkage between state-owned enterprise and state-owned banks. And under this current scheme, those linkage between state-owned enterprise and the state-owned banks likely to cause a inborn inefficiency. So they have to go through somehow privatization process down the road. So my question is that, do you believe in a genuine free enterprise system in China could come through? Under this, given, the single Communist Party system, although you mentioned that this one, command party quite succeeded in case of the Mexico, so on. But in case of China, such huge, the state-owned, the enterprise sectors and the huge, geographical locations, so on. Eventually, they need to adopt to sort of the multiple political party system to push through some alternative ideas or alternative, programs for reform. And that's the first question. Second question is that the U.S. is, keep saying that they are ready to accept China when they wish to join the Trans-Pacific, the partnership, the agreement. Okay, do you think this China, is ready to join if the U.S. and China, negotiate certain the entry conditions? How the Chinese authority feel about this U.S. anchored Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. An. They were quite good and fundamental questions. Now we have 6 questions altogether. Mr. Davis.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. No, the questions were all very good and very informed. On the internal factors, I think other than investment, investment's huge. You also have, it's kind of part of the same thing, but the giant growth in financing, which largely went to finance some of these crappy projects, and also to provide higher returns for savers. You look at the charts. They're scary. You look at the charts of the credit growth for the last 5 years, and they resemble, Korea before 1997, the U.S. before 2007, Europe, whenever, a few years beforehand. It's really, really quite striking. So that's one. And then the other is the general governance issue, that I alluded to. The internal reforms are difficult under the kind of system that they have. And there's a number of other questions on that, but I think that's a big issue. It's not just a question of, even if Xi gets his way and party officials are, models of rectitude and, don't steal anything, which won't happen. But even if he had that, that doesn't do away with the problems that they have governing. On the social compact, is the social compact fraying? That's really, really interesting. That's what the party is terrified of. I think what's interesting is that, to the degree you see in the middle class having some impact on policy now, there's no sort of environmental movement in China, because any movement in China gets squashed immediately because it's seen as a political threat. But environmental protests about a lead plant here, a nuclear processing plant there, actually work. There was one in, I think it was Guangdong, I forget where exactly, but just happened recently. There was this gigantic nuclear processing plant being planned for years. 1,000 protesters showed up. 1,000. This is a country with 1.35 billion people. My God, 1,000 protesters show up in Washington over, treaties I never heard of. And they scrapped it. That was really pretty remarkable to me. They are really quite, they recognize they have an environmental problem, and they're really, I think, worried that could be, a cause seen by the population as legitimate. Everybody has children. Everybody has to breathe the air. Everybody has to drink the water. Everybody has to eat the food, and they know it's poisoned. The people there, it's not the question of hiding it from people anymore. It's too obvious. So yeah, I think it's fraying, and the party is doing its best. That's the whole notion, I think, of Xi. One of the purposes of Xi's campaign is to try to get more respect, for the party, not through putting people in jail and imposing fear. I mean, they do that also. But I mean, some, sort of genuine respect that these are people that are trying their best to help improve their lives. But yeah, I mean, the question, I guess, is on the strict compact of better life versus allowing political control. I mean, I think the level at which that's essentially a question of unemployment. And it used to be seen as 8% was kind of the minimum, and now it appears that it's sort of 7% or 6.5%. Nobody really knows because the unemployment statistics are the worst that they have there, and also because they use the banking system to make loans to prevent bankruptcies. I think you can actually see the slowdown in the Chinese economy the effects more easily from outside of China, because you have companies that report, public companies that have to report, and you could see their profits going down. In China, and they may be public, but there's so many subsidies, and again, the lending masks things, so it's hard to say. And as to the question about post-reform, I agree with you entirely. I think you said 5 or 6%, I would sort of guess around 6%. But that in itself, I mean, that makes a big difference for people outside of China who are, say, selling iron ore to China. I mean, what the growth rate is. But if you had, then people here would have to tell me. I mean, you were saying the Koreans' growth rate fell from 8 to 4%. So let's say, for the sake of argument, it falls from sort of 8% to 6% or 5%. But if it's a 5% that's sustainable, and if it's a 5% that, because there are fewer people, the population is growing so much more slowly in China, which I assume was the case here as well. I mean, if it means that people are getting wealthier at the 5% rate as opposed to people not getting wealthier at 8%, I think the country's way better off. So that's basically the challenge. That's what they're hoping for. And they're also hoping that if they don't do this, it goes from 8% to 2%. And then then they really have problems. About SOEs and privatization and a multipolar system. I mean, it always seems impossible. I mean, my first, response to the question was, no, it never happened. But who would have predicted the Soviet Union? I mean, one of the most powerful, maybe the most powerful, the second most powerful nation on earth. And it changed essentially without shots being fired. I mean, it's just remarkable. Or the Arab Spring, or any of these sort of things. I mean, if it were to happen, of course you'd have to bet on the Communist Party retaining control and being smart enough to do that. But things happened here, things happened, it's just, I don't know. I mean, I once, back to Latin America, I once spent a night at, there's the, I'm forgetting the international institution, the Organization of the Americas. No power whatsoever. This gorgeous building in Washington, D.C., one of the prettiest buildings in Washington, but absolutely no power. And they have once a year, people from around the Americas come there, and these are human rights complaints. And if they feel that they've been if they disagree with the decision of their government, they can appeal it to this board. And the board will then issue a ruling which has no impact, which has no specific effect, but sometimes the government will be shamed into making the changes. And so I met a human rights lawyer, a guy, whose name I forget, but he runs the American University's law school, and I said to him, why do you bother? I mean, it's like, what's the point? And he said, people say he's Chilean, and he left Chile after Pinochet. And he said, people say that to me my whole life. And then, you look at Latin America now, which is, has its problems, but it's essentially all democratic. And you look at it 10 years ago, and you would have said that's impossible. So I guess that's just my answer. No, it seems incredibly unlikely, but, so did so many other things. As to the TPP in China, China was certainly afraid of TPP, looked at it as yet another way. The U.S. was trying to encircle it. Kind of amusing for someone like me who has covered trade in the U.S., which was, God, good luck getting anything through Congress anyway. I don't know what you're worried about. But I think now the view has changed somewhat. They are interested in it. They don't necessarily see it as a threat. The smartest thing they would do, I think the U.S. and the other partners are smart enough not to let this happen. The smartest thing they would do if they were really afraid of it is to join it and then slow it down so it never happens. But I think the partners are smart enough to sort of see that and to require commitments in advance, so you get at least the minimum. But there is some change. There is some change in attitudes toward it.
Thank you. I guess the deceleration of economic growth of China would be inevitable, whether they would reform or not. But still, it will be the main engine of global economic growth, because now the size of Chinese economy is much bigger, around 10%. 10% growth while their share is 5% growth, compared to 5% growth while their share is 10%. I guess has not changed much. So in that regard, the Chinese economic growth would be still important. Now we are going to second round. Dr. Kim, first. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bob. I feel like you are pretty much skeptical about the Chinese reform movement. So other than that, you talk a little bit about the NPLs, non-performing loans, and also housing bubbles. But if the Chinese economy is slowing down further, the NPL problem and the housing bubble is getting serious. So did you see any possibilities like financial crisis in China like you see in 2008 in state?
Thank you. Mr. Kim.
You quoted Wen Jiaobao's statement of unstable and unsustainable, and both are the biggest problems they have right now. Now, let me ask another question on top of that is, the current leadership is the least powerful in terms of controlling the military. Starting from Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, their leadership originally always had complete control of the military, which could get away with a lot of instability. But now, they do not have that kind of grip. And from the some informal statements, the annual amount of unrest in China is quoted to be in the tens of thousands. With the environment and the air and the lack of water, etc., and with the slowing down of the economy, now the unemployment will develop among particularly the educated. How do you see their task, and how do you think the military, the government would respond to those challenges?
Thank you. Chairman Hong.
Thank you. I intended to raise a question about SOE, state-owned enterprises, but Professor Han took the priority. I have two questions. One is about, you have just mentioned on the interest rate liberalization or some kind of movement. But for the time being, the impact is so serious. Therefore, I think that must be one of, theoretically, that should be deregulated, but not so easy task. So how do you foresee about the possibility of interest rate rearrangement, especially state-owned commercial banks that gives some discriminated privilege to SOE or huge corporations? And that will be my first question. Second one will be some related with NPL, but nowadays shadow financing in China getting more and more serious. So some people anticipate in coming soon that will visualize as a big serious problems in China's financial market. How do you foresee and do you anticipate about this subject? That's my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Okay. Let's see. On the, a couple of them were a little related. So on the NPLs and the housing bubble, NPLs are obviously understated. They're at less than 1%. It's ridiculous. A lot of the loans are just kept kept going by turning over loans and loans. In any other country, they'd be considered non-performing. And a housing bubble. Also, let's kind of wrap that into with shadow financing, which is also a big problem. How should I do this? So with shadow financing, I mean, the government has woken up to the problem. They had a big squeeze in liquidity engineered by the central bank. They may not have done it in the most elegant fashion, but it was clearly a signal to the banks to start lending to borrowers that were going to make, investments that made sense, not just sort of play these kind of financial games. So all of this is sort of related. One way to deal with the non-performing loans is to put some loans off your books. That's how that is the shadow sector. The housing bubble is created by, or is part of the problem of the housing bubble is even the loans that banks know are bad loans or risky loans these shadow institutions will make. So what happens? I mean, can it be a financial crisis on a U.S. style? Most experts don't think so. I agree only in the sense that they have so many, so many reserves. Aside from their $3.5 trillion in foreign reserves, Chinese people save immensely. At the central bank, there are all sorts of money they could use to respond to a crisis of that sort. I think more likely than a big collapse kind of bubble, a bubble that's collapsing, is you pay the price in slow growth. I mean, to the degree they are cracking down on shadow banking, their loans may not pay off the way they used to, but having less loans means you're going to have less growth. So that's what I think is the bigger risk, is not a collapse, but a, slow, kind of, not Lehman Brothers, as I said, but Japan. That's a closer model. On the military, this is way beyond what I usually cover. I guess what I just feel is that you can interpret Xi Jinping's China dream and efforts to sort of deal with the military as a way of solidifying his power with the military, which is possible, or also that he is as nationalistic as people in the military are. On the unrest, yeah, they have lots and lots of examples of that, but it's also a very low bar. I think they consider because they're such control freaks, I think they consider any minor protest, to be social unrest. And I wasn't quite sure if you meant, would the military respond? Would the military take power? I mean, God knows. I just have no idea about the true, and I don't think almost anyone does, about the true relations between the civil authorities and the military authorities. On interest rate liberalization, I think it will actually occur, or some will occur this year. It may feel different. And I think the way it would happen is by lowering the floor, as they say, allowing banks to have more flexibility in charging, in competing for borrowers by lowering the interest rate. Right now, there's a level below which they can't fall, and I think that's the way they'll experiment with it. I don't think they'll let deposit rates rise, because that one's a little too scary, and a lot of countries, including the United States, got into very deep trouble when they liberalized deposit rates, and in addition had deposit insurance, which they're putting together a deposit insurance scheme where then you can compete for customers, knowing that your customers are going to be paid off if the bank goes broke, but there's much less constraint on you from just promising the moon to get more deposits.
Thank you. If I may add a word on this interest rate liberalization. I think now in China, the floor on lending rate is not binding anymore. So the key is the ceiling on deposit rate and how we can slowly increase the margin on deposit rate. But the problem in China is they don't have indirect monetary control, so they are actually using deposit rate as a policy rate. And in order to liberalize that, they need indirect monetary control. But in order to introduce indirect monetary control, they should have reduced substantially the high reserve requirement, which is more than 20% now. And in order for them to do it, they have to have less intervention in the foreign exchange market. So the flexibility of a foreign exchange rate, monetary control, and deposit rate, interest rates are so all related problem. And I think they are quite determined to move on interest rate liberalization, but we still have to see specifically how they would be able to organize this. Let me go another round of questions. Dr. Kim first and Chairman Lim next.
Yeah, my question is, in a way, is a follow-up to what you have just discussed. How far is China away from achieving full convertibility of its currency?
Dr. Lim?
I am from Diplomacy Magazine, Lim. Very simple question. When you tell us about, when you comment on the Korean economy in brief, Korean economy in brief. When you comment on Korean economy in brief.
In brief, yes.
It has to be brief because I know almost nothing about it. Gosh, I wish I could say something intelligent on the Korean economy, but I think you guys have done great. So what can I say? I really, I've been so focused on China. I really haven't focused elsewhere. On full convertibility, you know, I don't know if it'll be full, but I think they're moving in a direction that would allow greater exchange rate flexibility. They have said publicly that they're going to, you know, the exchange rate can only move 1% up and down from a certain rate set by the central government every day. They're supposed to double that. In some ways it's symbolic, but in some ways it has an effect because it would make intervention more obvious and so subject them to more criticism. I think the more important question is how they set that so-called parity rate. Now it seems kind of by magic or whatever the central bank just pulls out of a hat. There is talk about, you know, some kind of rules-based system that would give more, people would be able to understand better what actually they're doing and that the market would have a stronger role in actually setting that. I think they're moving in that direction. To their great credit, I mean, they're moving in that direction while their export industry is suffering, and that in any country would be a difficult thing to do.
Thank you. If I again may add, I guess this full convertibility could be still far from the horizon because it requires exchange rate flexibility as well as capital account liberalization. But I think, as Mr. Davis said, they will go forward to have more increased internationalization of RMB through offshore market. Any more questions, comments? Now the final question, Professor Huang.
The widening income gap among regions in China will be a problem for the political democracy in China? That is my questions.
Yeah, I mean, rising inequality among regions, rising inequality among individuals is a huge problem there. It's an economic problem in the sense of only a portion of the economy realizing its potential and adding to the kind of demand becoming a true market, and the political question is huge. I mean, people who know, well, a lot of people know a lot more about China than I do, but I mean, with the history there of rebellions rising from, regions and then sweeping into China. When I got there, I mean, my background is an American, and I thought, are you really worried about that sort of thing? I mean, it seemed kind of ridiculous to me, but I think people who come from a different background, they may not literally think that, there's a peasant revolt in XYZ province, but it's from that kind of a perspective that they see the unrest and unhappiness on the part of the people, and then also the inequality question, is interlinked with the abuse of power question, with the corruption question. All that plays in. When you talk to ordinary Chinese people, what are the things that really get them angry? Things that get them angry are mostly this. Mostly, it's not that they are envious of people with money. It's more that they feel people with money got it, unfairly. That their kids are disadvantaged. That, that you have to have the right connections. That you have to be, not just a member of the party, but, a certain kind of state official. And that's what gives rise to this inequality. That really gets people annoyed. It's very interesting, conversation once with a young reporter who I knew in Washington a little bit. We covered the same thing. So I'm in Beijing. I happen to see him. We have dinner. He tells me that he just had a baby, and I congratulated him. And he said, my biggest fear is that my son will grow up in the middle of a civil war. And I said, really? Because if you asked American parents, their biggest fears, that would not be on the list. There'd be a lot of other things, but civil war, nah, that one wouldn't be on there. And I said, thinking, well, why do people have civil wars? I was thinking, there's a lot of minorities, unrest, but it's kind of a small percentage of the population. They tend to be geographically, isolated or great distances. He said, no. He said it was all about income inequality. At some point, people would just be fed up and wouldn't stand for it. So, that was really a shocker to me, and I think gets to the level of anger people do have over this inequality and over what they see the inequality leading to abuse of power.
Thank you. China has brilliant economic performance over the last 30 years, and in the course of that, they have successfully introduced economic reforms. Many observers say that now the low-hanging fruits are exhausted, and they are now facing a real core challenge of reform. That is the political and governance and ownership reform. And if there is a country which is the most strongly affected by the future course of China, it's perhaps Korea. And geographically, politically, security-wise, and economically. So we'll keep on watching closely about the development and the future paths of Chinese economy. And in that regard, I think today's discussion was very fruitful and helpful. And I would like to thank Mr. Davis for such insightful observation and keen analysis. And for the audience for such stimulating questions. So now we end today's forum, and please join me giving a big hand to Mr. Davis.